Japan's unfamiliar territory, a rare stabbing spree, shocks one of the safest countries in the world. Also on today's program, we go inside Mongolia for a look at how the country's embrace of modernity is impacting nomadic herders. And in Picture This, fierce flash floods sweep through Nepal. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. It was Japan's most fatal mass killing since World War II. On Tuesday, a former employee of a facility for the disabled went on a stabbing spree, targeting the very people he had assisted for years. He killed at least 19 and injured dozens more, sending a piercing chill through a country known for its low crime rate. It's raised questions on whether the nation's reputation for safety is contributing to lackluster crime prevention. Now, today's newsmaker is Japan, as we ask if the country is becoming too safe for comfort, leaving the possibility of violent crime wide open.
It was an attack on the most vulnerable. 19 people inside a care home, murdered in their beds at night by a former employee. 26-year-old Satoshi Uematsu later turned himself into police and smiled for the cameras. He detailed his plans to kill hundreds of disabled people in a letter he sent to the Japanese government months before.
The act will be carried out speedily and definitely without harming the staff. After wiping out the 260 people in 2 facilities, I will turn myself in.
When Uematsu left his job at the care home in February, he spent time in a mental health facility, but doctors were confident he'd recovered and released him.
The suspect has been portrayed as having delusions, but I beg to differ. I think he did what he did out of conviction. He was not mentally ill.
There's shock across Japan and in the Sagamihara community.
If there were signs, then I'd understand. But there weren't any. It is regrettable that as a human being, we could not notice the darkness he carried in his heart.
And it's all the more horrific in a country where crime is so rare. Last year, the number of crimes reported in Japan was the lowest since World War II. Police officers carry guns, but rarely use them. According to national police, only 8 crimes were committed last year in which guns were fired. That's in a country of 127 million people. Even gangsters belonging to Japan's Yakuza criminal network fear spending years in jail for carrying a firearm. A UN study has also put Japan's safety record down to decades of economic wealth and low inequality. Criminals also face a tough justice system and, in some cases, the death penalty. Another powerful deterrent is the stigma of arrest for any crime in Japanese society.
When you commit a crime, you also the society blames not just you, but your family or your community for your crimes.
But the country hasn't been immune to mass killings. The most violent was a nerve gas attack on Tokyo's subway by a religious cult in 1995, which killed 12 and injured more than 5,000. 8 school children were killed in a stabbing attack in 2001, 7 people were murdered in central Tokyo in 2008, and 14 bus passengers were stabbed outside a railway station in 2010. The stabbings at Sagamihara have already triggered better security measures at medical facilities, echoing a growing concern that the rarity of crime in Japan has perhaps created a false sense of safety. Sandra Gathmann, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me here in the studio is Sandra Gathmann, who put together that report. Sandra, thanks for coming in. What's so remarkable about Japan is this sense of societal discipline, if I can call it that, and the shame that comes with committing crime. And there really is an investment, correct me if I'm wrong, in collective safety. So how does Japan manage that while other countries don't?
Well, Andrea, I think Japan is really an anomaly in that respect, and historians and sociologists across the board will point to the fact that this all really started after World War II. This is part of Japan's pacifist role after that horrible war, which they lost so badly. And since then, this feeling of, as you say, kind of collective safety has really come into force, and it's almost a self-policing community, this sense of social awareness of others, taking responsibility not just for your own actions, but those around you. That is really instilled in you from a very young age. I saw it when I grew up there in Japan, at my school. It carries through into your working life and the business world as well. And I think people look out for each other. And many Japanese friends of mine, commentators, analysts, will agree that sticking out in Japan is seen as a kind of selfish move. There are, of course, rebels, and is, of course, crime in Japan, but that kind of sense of looking out for each other, not disturbing the peace. There's 175 million Japanese people living on a small island. If anything goes wrong, then people just can't live together in harmony, and that's their biggest fear.
But that looking out for each other also goes alongside a serious sense of kind of individualism, as if you don't burden the rest of your society.
Absolutely, and I think that is part of the reaction when any crime is committed across Japan. It's how dare you disrupt the image we had of you. We thought you were a friendly neighbor. We can't comprehend how you were able to, from one second to the next, cause such a tragedy. As well as the fact that, you know, if you take the transport system, for instance, a minute's delay is going to disrupt the entire society, and that's very much the way people think there.
I've experienced that, yes. Okay, this particular attack, though, has actually been labeled a hate crime against disabled people. That's something that's rarely heard of in Western countries, where hate crimes are usually targeted at race, religion, sexual orientation. Why are the disabled vulnerable in Japan?
I think we have to keep in mind that something like this has never happened in Japan. But having said that, people I've been speaking to do admit that there is a stigma associated with people of disabilities, the handicapped, especially mentally impaired people. I remember growing up in Japan, next to my school there were plans to build a mental asylum, and you could hear the anxieties, people complaining about the fact that, you know, these people were a danger to society, to their kids, and they were well and truly against the building of this mental asylum. And so the questions at the moment are around, well, there seems to have been a huge emphasis on security measures to keep disabled people within the confines of these care homes and not to keep dangers out. So that's really the sad reality in Japan. I can't say that across the board disabled people are thought of as inferior or stigmatized, but the fact that this hate crime really took place is shocking to everyone.
But there's also a sense of irony there in the fact that disabled people, well, the state itself takes such good care and invests so much financially in the care of its most vulnerable people, including the mentally and physically handicapped, as well as the elderly.
That's right. I think part of that, though, is due to international pressure. Japan finally signed up to the UN Convention on Rights for the Disabled years after it came into force. They only signed it back in 2014, and as a result, they are providing that care to disabled people and the elderly, of course, that make up the majority of Japanese people. And having said that, the robotics industry that Japan is famous for, anywhere from the automakers to private tech companies, they're trying to contribute as well. And even last year, Japan really shone a spotlight on the need and the opportunity in the tech industry. They created an exoskeleton that is going to hit the shelves in the UK to help people walk again. And so they are moving in a positive way. There are steps being taken.
Okay, so to talk more, though, about the institutional mechanisms, the laws that keep Japan safe. Gun rights, for example, are reserved for a tiny handful of people in Japan.
That's absolutely right. I think reports everywhere point to the fact that it's Japan's gun laws that really make it a safe country to live in. Getting a gun in Japan is extremely difficult. The statistics show that 1 in 175 households possess a firearm, and even most of those are hunting rifles. And even getting a license to use those weapons are very difficult. There are all kinds of criminal background checks, medical checks that have to take place in order to possess a gun. And then those licenses are revisited annually. So you don't see many guns on the streets. Police do carry them, but when they're patrolling streets in a neighborhood, when they're guarding a shopping mall, for instance, they rarely have them in their possession. They leave them in police stations.
Okay, Sandra, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming in. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Mongolia's modern dilemma, how the world's most scarcely populated nation is grappling with global change. And in Picture This, monsoon rains pound Nepal, leaving landslides and flooding in their wake. Well, the world's most sparsely populated country is grappling with the effects of modernity. Twice the size of France, but home to only 3 million citizens, Mongolia has long been host to a more ancient way of life. Nomadic herders still represent a third of the population, but economic and climate changes are driving them away in search of better opportunities. Shamim Chowdhury reports from the grasslands of northern Mongolia.
Way of life, unchanged for centuries. Mongolia's nomadic herders, a people devoted to their animals. It's a simple but tough existence, and it's getting tougher. So many are being lured away by the bright lights of the city. Like Bechimig, who's just finished school. She now plans to move to the capital. But her father, Batu, feels torn by her decision. He worries that the way of life of his ancestors will die out.
Young people are now moving to the city more and more. I worry about it, as one has to work in order to live. One has to know the nature of work and then live and experience hardships.
I think it's difficult to live here. There are many animals that need looking after, and if you don't look after them well, their numbers will dwindle. I think it's easier to live in the city.
Batu himself once tried his luck in the city, but it wasn't all he hoped it would be.
I was living from paycheck to paycheck, and there was much need for money in everyday things such as going by bus and getting food. I couldn't save any money.
He returned to his herd, but life remains a daily struggle. Batu owns a few hundred goats, sheep and cows, but others own thousands, hoping to increase their income. There's more than 50 million livestock countrywide. It's led to an oversupply, overgrazing and desertification. A lack of animal vaccinations means livestock can't be exported. And there's little domestic demand for meat, wool and milk. Then there's the problem of remoteness. Thousands of herding families across Mongolia live hundreds of kilometres from towns and villages. It's causing many people, particularly the young, to look to the capital for schools, jobs and healthcare. In 2006, there were around 170,000 herder families spread across the country. But by last year, that number dropped to just over 150,000. That's a fall of around 12%. 3 generations of family call these grasslands home. Batu's wife is pregnant. They hope their child will carry on the ancient tradition his daughter will leave behind. A new day, and there's a lot of ground to cover. The only source of water here is several kilometres away. Nothing is provided for the people of this land. Survival means self-sufficiency, and that's why so many want to escape. Mongolia's capital, a city of 1 million people, holding hopes of wealth and comfort, where a select few enjoy the profits from the country's vast mineral reserves. But for most, it's a different story. 30% of the population live below the poverty line, and in the capital, Ulaanbaatar, around 60% live in slum-like areas on the edge of the city. This is where many herders are forced to live, gur or tent cities with no sanitation or water supply. Ganghuyek's entire herd died due to extreme weather. And things haven't worked out here either. He can't find a full-time job and struggles to support his 3 children.
I wish I had livestock to herd. My salary is not enough to make ends meet. Now, looking back, I think living in the countryside was better. But since we moved to the city, we have to stay, and I hope things will improve. Maybe someday we can go back.
But city life hasn't dampened the spirit of the nomadic people. Ganghuyek has held on to his dreams. He still has hopes for his son, a university education and a better future. He can only pray things will improve as he struggles to make his way in this place so far from home.
Joining me now in the studio are Shamim Chowdhury and John Joe Regan, who just got back from Mongolia, where they produced that report for us. Thanks both so much for coming in. So you spent a fair amount of time, particularly with these nomadic herders in Mongolia. We saw a picture of it in the report you did, but I want you to tell us personally what you witnessed, more about what life is like and how it impacted you. Shamim, go ahead.
Well, in many ways, it's a very basic lifestyle. Every day is filled with hardships. From the moment they wake up, they need water. They don't have drinking water close by, so that involves getting into a little scooter, driving several miles with a container, bringing water back. And then when they need to cook food, they need to chop firewood. In the evening, the cows need milking. It is daily graft. And actually, on one of the nights that we were there, the family that we stayed with have about between 200 and 300 livestock, goats, sheep and cows, and they went missing. It was late at night, it had got dark, and there was a real sense of panic. You know, for a good few hours, the family went out, including the wife, and we were told that they're not going to come back until they find their herd. And that really gave us a real sense. It really brought home just how dependent these families, a third of Mongolia's population, are on their herd, and without them they have nothing. So it is very much a daily struggle.
And oftentimes there's this sort of romantic attachment to traditional ways of life in a country, even while that way of life becomes less and less tenable. Is that what you're seeing in Mongolia, or is it still fundamentally important to Mongolia's history and culture to keep that way of life alive?
I don't know if it's so much important as a necessity. I mean, for many of these people, there is really no option. But certainly there is an affection there. So there's a genuine affection, a genuine love of the land. And if you speak to the older generation, we spoke to the grandmother, it's obvious when you chat to her that this is in her blood, it's in her soul, it's all she knows, and she has a real passion for it. But then you get a difference of opinion as you go down the generations. You know, the father was telling us how reluctantly he has conceded to the fact that his daughter will move move to the city because he actually wants better opportunities for her. And you're seeing that more and more across the country. But then there are young people too who love the land and want to stay there. Now, whether they're doing that because they know that actually realistically there's not many opportunities for them in the city, or whether they genuinely love the land. I mean, I guess it's a mixture of both. So you are seeing this kind of change of attitudes, but there is a kind of difference among the generations.
And Janjo, I mean, Mongolia is a developing country, and like so many others, there are stark differences between rich and poor. How dramatic was the difference in Mongolia?
It's pretty dramatic. In the capital, Ulaanbaatar, you have this central area which is all glistening buildings, lots of luxury apartment blocks. But on the outskirts, you've got this huge amount of slum-like areas. You know, they're living in these traditional tents, but in the city, off the grid, and not able to tap into sewage, water, electricity. The vast amount of the wealth that Mongolia sees is from the mining industry. And so we've seen a lot of money come in. I mean, it accounts for a huge amount of the economy, but most incredibly, it accounts for over 90% of Mongolia's exports. And we've seen lots of foreign investment come in recent years, and one of the biggest mines in Mongolia is by the Anglo-Australian company Rio Tinto. Their Oyu Tolgoi mine, a copper mine, is 125 miles worth of tunnels. That's about roughly the size of Manhattan underground. It's 3 times as deep as the Empire State Building is tall. Just this year, $5.3 billion was spent to extend it. And when it launched about 6 years ago, that project, you had Mongolia's economy grow by 17%. And so that huge amount of cash coming in is very visible on the streets of the capital, Ulaanbaatar. But as you say, you see that very stark contrast.
So it's not being distributed, you can fairly say.
Well, yes.
Go.
And so there, what you have with the mining industry is 2 main criticisms. You have, on the first hand, you've got the older mines, which are raising huge environmental concerns, and it's the newer mines which are raising more social concerns. And we went to a mine about 60 kilometers outside the capital, Ulaanbaatar, and that was closed about 25 years ago. But what you see there is a film of coal dust that litters the land around it for miles. You've also got people who are trying to mine around it to try and eke out the last bit of coal illegally. And they're facing toxic gases and shaft collapses. Hundreds of people have died in recent years. With the newer mines, it's more of the criticism over, who is benefiting. What you're seeing is this huge amount of money being spent, being brought into the country, and who there is benefiting. Well, one of the amazing things we learnt was that only about 1,000 families across Mongolia own about 95% of the money in Mongolian banks. And so that says everything, really.
Okay, Shamim and Janjo, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for sharing your experience in Mongolia.
Later.
In today's Picture This, thousands of people have been forced from their homes in South Asia as flash floods and landslides claim more and more lives. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker was Japan, as we asked if the country is becoming too safe for comfort, leaving the possibility of violent crime wide open. Last year, the number of crimes reported in Japan was the lowest since World War II. Strict gun laws, the stigmatization of crime, and a tough justice system are common factors experts point to for what's working. But on Tuesday, a former employee of a facility for the disabled went on a stabbing spree, killing at least 19 people. It's raised questions on whether the nation's reputation for safety is creating a false sense of security. You've been watching this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.